Welcome to SOX 404 Implementation Approach. In the previous blog, we covered SOX 404 requirements. Now we get practical and tactical. In this session, we answer the following questions. Who runs the SOX 404 process? What's the suggested implementation approach? How long does SOX 404 compliance take? And then we dive into steps 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So let's get to it. Who runs the SOX 404 process? Typically, finance or internal audit runs the program. Smaller companies often outsource or co-source the 404 compliance process because of the expertise and the bandwidth required in a short period of time to successfully implement the program. Typically, it's a one-person job, but what happens is certain times of the year, there's a lot of work that happens in a 2 to 3 week period that you need more than one person, which is oftentimes why you need to co-source or outsource the process. Regardless of who you use though, internal resources or co-source service provider, the best practice is to have them report directly to the audit committee. They can have a dotted line to the CFO because of the day-to-day interactions, or to the controller for that matter, but the external auditors are more likely to place reliance on the work performed by a third party if they report to the audit committee and are shown to be independent of the management team. Within SOX 404, we also recommend that legal owns the company-wide policies like the employee codes of conduct, like insider trading and FCPA, because that has more regulatory implications, so it doesn't fall quite as much into the finance or internal audit teams. So what is the suggested 404 implementation approach? The key to success in the first year is training and education. For younger companies, many of your employees may not have worked for public companies before or are new to the process. They don't have that muscle memory to know these are the things that have to happen. So the more that legal and finance teams communicate and train, the easier the adoption and implementation. And the 5 basic steps, regardless of who you go to, these are the 5 steps that happen. 1 is planning. Step 2 is documenting the controls and processes. Step 3 is testing. Step 4 is the remediation. And step 5 is evaluating and concluding on the controls. So how long does SOX 404 compliance take? Now, it typically takes 6 to 12 months depending on how intensely you want to focus. It takes about 6 months if you are just doing 404A, which is the interviews and the documentations and some light walkthrough. But if you actually have to do testing for the year, it's going to take at least the 12 months. And the Gantt chart below is an example of a 12-month timeline for you to do planning, documentation, walkthroughs, and testing. And you'll see here we actually color-coded it to show you we start typically in the beginning of the year around the February or March timeframe with risk assessments and planning, and we do the documentation and a walkthrough of all the various processes, and then we allocate time to do round 1 testing, round 2 testing, and finally the year end. And that's to give us time to remediate and take a pulse of the processes. In a separate blog, we'll actually go through the details of how to build a project timeline to accommodate all of these various things that you have to think about. But let's dive into step 1. And what we've done here is we've given you specific tasks and deliverables so that you know the activities that you're doing and the output from the activities. So we start out with developing a project plan. We then determine materiality and do the risk assessment. We scope significant accounts, systems, and processes and locations. And then we summarize all of this in a short compliance memo. So in the output, you'll see that we typically then get a project plan, we get timelines and deadlines from it. We also then produce a materiality assessment and a risk assessment with significant accounts, systems, processes, and locations to test. And the best practice is if you can summarize it in a short memo so that the auditors and anyone stepping behind you, coming after you, can understand the rationale of the decisions that you make, whether you want to test one area more than another. Step 2 of this is then to document. That's where you will interview key management and process owners to understand key business processes and controls. You then prepare a narrative, and some clients actually do a flow chart as well, or you can do one or the other. And then from the interviews, you can make recommendations on process improvements. You can see the gaps from there between the controls that are in place and the controls that need to be in place. And you want to then review the documentation with the process owners and make tweaks as needed. And you want to also finalize and sign off with the process owners to say, hey, we've agreed, this is what we're going to, our key controls, these are the types of activities that you're going to do as part of the control. So that's the documentation phase of it. Step 3 is the testing. And in testing, we've actually lumped the test of design of the control and also test of operating effectiveness. So what we do is we set up meetings with the process owners, and we take a sample of one of each of the key controls and we do a walkthrough, literally taking examples of documents that they would review, walking through as if that document was flowing through the whole process to understand. Sometimes in interviews, people will tell us things that they should do, and then when you actually have an example, they remember other things that they do or things that you can then ask them, do you really look at these areas or do you just glance at it? Where do you focus it on? So it's great to always do a walkthrough to really verify your narratives. And then you want to document the steps that you've taken to assess the design of that control. And then next, you design the testing procedures for the key controls. We send out the information request to the key owners and give them time to prepare it. We get the items back and we then actually do the sample size testings to verify that the controls are actually operating effectively and conclude on, in this round of testing, are the controls effective? And the typical deliverables that you get out of this, or the typical output, is your documentation walkthrough. You will also then have a risk control matrix with the proposed testing, and then the actual testing and the results, and any of the supporting documentation. So that's part of step 3. Step 4 and 5 look very simple, but they actually take one of the longest times to do, is once you've assess the design, you might have to then remediate. You might have to solve certain control gaps, and that takes time to put in place because whether it's in the system or in the manual controls, and that's where the process owners need that time to put it in place. And the output from that is usually an issues tracking log. So from the testing, we'll identify observations or issues, and now we're starting to track, and what's the remediation plan? How quickly is management able to put some of these steps in place? And then finally, at the end of the year is when we conclude on the controls and we document our conclusions. And at the end of the year, that's also when we have to reassess materiality, because at the beginning of the year, we assess materiality and risk based on our forecast, based on a budget. But now that the whole year's gone by, maybe there are new divisions that have grown, new acquisitions that weren't anticipated, and you now have to look at the materiality. You also you will have your final issues log. All the issues that you identified early on, well, some of them you've remediated. What's left that's not remediated that you have to follow up with in the following year? And then finally, we recommend a memo to summarize Here's what we said we would do. Here's what we did do. Here are the issues that we found, and we've concluded that there are no material weaknesses or there are no significant deficiencies. So it's nice to have everything wrapped up in one place so that, again, anyone following behind you can say, yep, they took all the same steps that we would have taken. And there might have been some judgment calls based on the information you know at the time, but we all agree that it's the right step given the information available. So that's a quick summary of the SOX 404 implementation approach. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you in the next session.